Bonsoir et bienvenue au CCA. Je suis Kim Förster, directeur associé de la recherche ici au CCA. And tonight we have the fourth of 5 public events that we organize in connection with our Toolkit for today. And I would like to especially welcome tonight's speaker, Torsten Lange, here in the middle of the table. Each summer, in the framework of our doctoral students program, the CCA invites scholars, practitioners, and thinkers to reveal their tools to propose concepts and methods in order to elaborate on a specific topic, and equally important, to make us think out of our boxes. In the framework of this year's Toolkit, we discuss activisms. More precisely, we would like to interrogate the different forms that an engaged practice can take for scholars of architecture. We ask what motivates research, how can architectural research be mobilized in the service of society, how did or does architecture relate to larger societal issues. As in a changing academic landscape, there are obviously limitations to what can be said and what not. Yet more important, the question remains when and how to take position. So to discuss concrete cases of what by some might be considered as activist research and practice, and to complicate how architecture as well as architectural history and theory relate to society, we've invited 5 speakers from quite different contexts to present one of their recent projects. In 5 public presentations at nighttime, our guests put up for discussion how, through their work, they analyze and interpret the social production of space, attempt to decolonialize architectural education, propose to apply strategies to rethink housing and labor, and, as in the case of Torsten Lange, create platforms to implement gender parity, as well as problematize racial politics in architecture history. During daytime, then, in seminars and workshops together with the doctoral students and residents at the CCA over the summer, they further elaborate their own approaches and experiences with regard to the politics and economies of research, different research methodologies, and consequences for their practice and teaching. Activisms in the past have been a constant concern of the CCA over the past couple of years, most explicitly with certain exhibitions, publications, and research projects. But what is more, the CCA understands everything it does as activists, promoting architecture as a public concern. In this sense, an exhibition such as Actions, What You Can Do with a City in 2008 featured common activities such as walking, playing, recycling, and gardening to push against accepted norms of behaviors in cities, sometimes even challenging legal limitations. And The Other Architect in 2015 presented alternative, often collaborative practices to develop architecture as a field of energetic, critical, and radical research addressing the urgent issues of our time. Another thematic focus at the CCA that takes position is the environmental debate. And while the exhibition Sorry Out of Gas in 2007 captured architectural innovation spurred by the 1973 oil crisis, the exhibition It's All Happening So Fast in 2016 offered a counter history of the modern Canadian environment, challenging basic assumptions about the country's relationship to nature by focusing on environmental disasters since World War II. The multidisciplinary collaborative research project Architecture and for the Environment then that we currently run explores the tensions between architectural evidence and historiographic narratives by proposing alternative curricula or by writing heritage petitions. Activisms, in terms of research, as we argue with this toolkit, thus can take quite complex forms, encompassing different types of social, cultural, and political action and agency, given that the once existing binary structure, that of establishment versus counterculture, system versus movement, above versus below, power versus subversion, is no longer valid. With recent developments of neoliberalism and an accelerated individualism and consumerism, previous societal achievements, for example, that of critical theory, of diversity politics, or of multiculturalism programs, in our post-political and one could add post-critical or even post-historical times, tend to have become compromised, if not co-opted or corrupted. So tonight, Torsten Lange will present on implementing gender parity. Torsten is visiting lecturer at the Institute GTA for History and Theory of Architecture at the ETH in Zurich. He received his PhD from the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College of London in 2015. And in his dissertation thesis titled Komplexe Umweltgestaltung, or Complex Environmental Design, he discussed architectural theory and the production of the built environment in the German Democratic Republic in between 1960 to 1990. Previously, Torsten has worked for the chair of Akos Morawansky at ETH Zurich and has lectured at the University of Brighton. And currently he's active in the European Architectural History Network, especially the Architecture and the Environment interest group there. And at ETH in Zurich, he's a member of the Parity Group, a grassroots initiative which was formed by academic staff and students from within the Department of Architecture to achieve and monitor gender parity at all levels of teaching and administration, and together with the Parity Talks, is subject of his presentation tonight. Together with Charlotte Malter-Barth, he has published an article on the group's actions titled Architects Who Make a Fuss, which was first published in the ETH Zurich-based students' journal Trans, and then in June this year in the Canadian Site magazine. So far, we already had 3 presentations this week. On Monday, Tatjana Schneider spoke about problematizing social engagement, followed by Pilin Tan, who on Tuesday spoke about decolonializing architecture education, and Andreas Rumpfhuber, who yesterday proposed to rethink public housing. Since we are filming the toolkit to publish them on the CCA website, you will be able to watch them in case you have missed past talks or will be missing the upcoming one tomorrow by Charles Davis, who will present on racing architectural history. So after the presentation, we invite everybody to join in the discussion. And to kick this off, we have asked participants of the toolkit who are here on this side of the table to prepare and ask some questions. But there's also time for a Q&A, and Jacqueline Meyer over there, who is a research curatorial researcher at the CCA, will moderate the discussion. As an announcement, we have a bookstore, and in the bookstore there's many books of the participants of this toolkit, so I invite you, since today is Thursday night, to go there afterwards and check out the books. So please join me now in welcoming Torsten Lange.
Right, okay, I'll start then. So thank you, Kim, and thanks to the organizers here at the CCA for the invitation. Thanks to the audience for being here tonight. It's a really wonderful opportunity to participate in this kind of intense week of collective thinking and discussion about the issue of activisms in architecture, even if, like some of my colleagues who spoke before me in this event, I also share a degree of skepticism, perhaps, about this notion of activism in architecture, and we can return to that perhaps later in the discussion. Now, this applies in particular to the work that I'm going to talk about tonight, and that I've been involved with as part of the Parity Group, as Kim has mentioned, at ETH Zurich over the past 3 or so years. So the organizers have proposed the, as I first thought, slightly overly optimistic title, Implementing Gender Parity, and my initial critical reaction to that title was to change it in order to avoid misrepresenting the far more messy state of affairs in our institution by concealing or by covering up perhaps some of the difficulties and obstacles that we have come across in that process of seeking to implement gender parity within our department and its structures. In other words, I was kind of somewhat cautious to end up repeating the official rhetoric of the institution, which, perhaps little surprise, is kind of keen to transmit a positive image to the outside. But then, considering the power that language can have in shaping reality, I felt in the end that the title might indeed work rather well, and that despite all the setbacks, what we are actually doing is implementing gender parity, if so far taking very small steps. So who are we? And I'm going to use this first-person plural pronoun rather often tonight to emphasize both the collective and collaborative nature of our work. So as I just mentioned, we're the Parity group, and this group basically consists of several individuals, not all of them mentioned here on that slide that you can see. So there are many more fellow travelers. The group started as quite a loose group. Importantly, these include, for instance, the international PhD students from the Institute GTA's doctoral program. But I'd like to mention specifically here my colleagues Charlotte Malter-Barth, Eliana Perotti, Christopher Metz, before him Harald Stühlinger, who have all been absolutely crucial in initiating this debate. The group started gathering for the first time at the end of 2014 after another round of final design studio reviews with several all-male panels. Since then, it quickly developed into a grassroots initiative by academic staff and students from within our department who shared a kind of sense of discontent with the persistent gender inequality within the architecture department in our institution and the gender gap within the discipline more broadly, which is visible above all in the lack of women in leadership positions. Many of us were also inspired by what was going on in the social sphere outside the institution. That is the kind of recent international feminist revival, what has become known as feminism's fourth wave, and its globally networked forms of protest against persistent injustices, as well as new forms of sexism and misogyny. So motivated by an ethics of self-help and collaboration, we set out to develop strategies for greater gender equality, diversity, and an inclusive approach to architectural research and education, along with the necessary institutional structures to safeguard the successful and lasting implementation of these measures. So perhaps rather than implementation, it might be this need for institutionalization that is the underlying theme for my talk tonight, and this, I think, is also where there might be a point of friction with the notion of activism. So my talk will basically recount and critically reflect on our efforts to act from within an institution, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, which has by and large remained a white male bastion, despite admitting women into its halls from its very founding in 1855. So what I'll try to offer is a situated perspective of our activities, placing a special focus on the Parity Talks, a series of annual symposia and workshops that were convened by us. And these events have not only been crucial to shaping our agenda internally, most importantly the production of the so-called 9 points for parity, but have also helped to establish a network with other like-minded activist groups and international experts in order to collectively work through questions of gender and the built environment. So what I hope to discuss tonight then are the potentials and limitations for criticality from within, or as Isabelle Stengers and Vincent Desprez write, for making a fuss, as well as the pleasures and perils of voluntary work in a setting that is defined as much by notions of disciplinarity and excellence, as well as by the mechanisms of assessment in today's academic capitalism. Now, I should mention, and Kim has done that already, that many of these reflections build on an article that Charlotte Malter-Barth and I first co-authored about a year ago for a special issue of our department's student-led journal, Trans, which was then recently republished in edited form as part of the special volumes Feminisms of Side magazine here in Canada. So the original piece was basically written at a moment when we experienced again what we have come to call parity fatigue, i.e. When we became acutely aware of the problematic reliance of our institution on our voluntary free labor and came to recognize more than ever the need to build lasting structures that would allow us to sustain this work. And that then also became our key demand in a way and remains a site for struggle at the moment with the department. So back then, we faced a crucial vote in the so-called departmental conference, the main decision-making body within our faculty, which includes professors as well as representatives of the assistants and student bodies. So when finally in May 2017, the Professors' Conference, which is the body of the senior faculty that discusses departmental affairs, voted unanimously to adopt and implement a gender action plan for the department. This decision then also marked a commitment to institutionalize the work of the Parity Group, which up to this point had been carried out on a kind of informal and purely voluntary basis. Now, just to perhaps kind of contextualize the development of this gender action plan within ETH, so the ETH leadership has basically founded an institution called ETH Equal within, it's like an equal opportunities office. They have produced a gender action plan in 2013 as a kind of non-binding institutional strategy, and then the implementation of that plan was then delegated to the individual departments. And so this work hadn't been done within the architecture department, even though that would have been the duty of the department leadership. So we basically sort of kept pushing that action is actually happening. So since that time, a Parity Board, which has subsequently been formalized as the Parity and Diversity Committee, was established for the delivery of this plan. The task that in a way kind of still lies ahead of us, and this is why the title perhaps of the talk is slightly misleading, is basically to formulate and implement a series of concrete measures in line with both the needs of the department and the terms that have been set out by the ETH Executive Board. But perhaps I just go back a little bit to the point when I joined ETH in 2013 and then got involved with the Parity Group a couple of years later to kind of give an impression of what the school is like. So I came from the Bartlett School of Architecture in London, where I had completed a master's and then a PhD in architectural history and theory under the supervision of Jane Rendell. And so without necessarily addressing questions of gender in my own work, I was still highly influenced by the strong critical feminist tradition and the intellectual environment more broadly at the Bartlett. So the ideas and practices that Rendell referred to as critical spatial practices in particular. When I then moved to ETH, I was quickly reminded of the extent to which the architectural discipline and the profession, in some places perhaps more than others, remained deeply patriarchal, and how this seemed profoundly out of step with the realities and challenges of contemporary practice. So for me, and this is true for many of my colleagues at the Parity Group as well, architecture is fundamentally about imagining a desired future. And so we asked us how it is then that today, almost a century after the adoption of the female vote in most European countries, Switzerland is an exception here, but I'll come back to that, it is still men who plan this future, and particularly a sort of very small and homogeneous group of men that is predominantly white and middle class. So even if we're becoming increasingly aware of the ways in which kind of great diversity of people are affected by design decisions, the faction of those who actually make those decisions is diversifying at an almost imperceptible pace. So men continue to dominate not only the profession of architecture, but also architectural education. And we really felt that this could be felt especially at ETH. So in the conjuncture then, architecture and academia to us seemed to be particularly impenetrable. In a way, kind of like an ultra-hard block of cement, architectural education seemed exceptionally resistant to cracks and changes, and more often than not, in trying to secure its disciplinary integrity, the internal power structures of this monolith appear to be working against women. So of course one can always blame some distant or outside force, an abstract kind of social, political, or economic context that first has to change in order for academia to follow suit, but to us this in a way kind of meant overlooking the inherent contradictions and struggles within the institution itself. Now, just to explain sort of what the situation is like right now, so even though there is near gender parity in the student body in the architecture department, career opportunities in the field of architecture for women continue to look dire. At the end of 2013, about 44.5% of our students were female, while only 11.8% of the professorships were held by women. And this cartoon, which advertises the two built environment study programs at ETH, architecture on the left and civil engineering on the right, perhaps kind of shows how much work still needs to be done to get rid of these kind of deeply entrenched stereotypes and images. And I guess the cartoon would be funny if it weren't quite so close to reality. So the shockingly low number of female professors at ETH appears to be but the tip of an iceberg that in a way is kind of much bigger and requires a systemic approach in order to be adequately tackled. So in 2016, and this are just figures from the gender monitoring report conducted by ETH, the proportion of female professors in the university in total amounted to 13.5% and was therefore lower than the current objective agreement between ETH Zurich and the ETH board, which sets a target of 15%. Yeah, so that's also quite a low target, just to bear that in mind. So on the level of students, doctoral candidates, and scientific staff, the proportion of women has remained relatively stable, around 30% among students and PhD candidates, and 25% for academic staff. Now, with student numbers above and female professors below the average, this gap seems then even more pronounced in the architecture department. So against this background and in this context, basically, we saw the retirement of several senior faculty members in 2015 and the process of appointing nearly 10 professors over the course of a 4-year period as an opportunity to address this inequality directly with the institution and to demand steps to be taken towards the equal representation of men and women within the school. Now, to return perhaps to this kind of image of the iceberg, this photo basically shows a kind of leaflet that is being sent out to all members of the faculty every semester. What you see here is kind of summary of the departmental lecture series and panel discussions. And so these lecture series in that particular year were completely composed exclusively of male speakers. And you can see that our first event, the Parity Talks in 2016, was the only exception here. So yeah, this basically means that for about half of the student body, role models are lacking, and a student member of our group, Yasmin Ma, has once described this experience as being allowed in by the institution only as a guest. So against this backdrop of a kind of male-centric culture in our institution and a kind of widespread lack of awareness regarding the ways in which the system of architectural academia is pitted against women, Charlotte Malter-Bartz and Harald Stühlinger, along with others, then began to lobby for the introduction of a discussion platform to counter the prevalent cultural obliviousness to gender bias and to address and transform its deep-rooted structural causes. I should mention perhaps that within the Swiss context of the discipline, constructed work is valued above anything else. architectural practice, however, in various ways, and most importantly, due to its labor conditions, as numerous studies have shown, continues to disadvantage women. So the fast track to build work doesn't depend only on talent and hard work, but largely relies on other factors such as social networks, the kind of idea of an old boys club, on personal capital, trusting clients, all of which then tend to be less available to women than to men. As an example, the culture of long working hours, as women overwhelmingly continue to bear the weight of family work and care, means that they are then less likely to stay late at the office for the sake of promotion. Also within architectural academia, particularly also within our school, the size of an oeuvre is often considered analogous or equivalent to one's degree of excellence. So valuing the number of buildings an architect produces in their lifetime, as well as a kind of admiration towards achievements at a young age, are then consequently among these standards that put women architects at an automatic disadvantage when it comes to appointment processes. So from the outset, our work then focused on designing concrete measures to improve gender parity at all levels of the department, but especially in these kind of appointment procedures of professors. And as early as June 2015, so the group started just half a year earlier, through a kind of collaborative process among assistants, we began identifying 5 key measures to tackle this. These measures included, first of all, the production of a directory of female practitioners and scholars, which has since become available as a resource. And this was to counter the tired argument that was often repeated by men, but also sadly women in our school, that there aren't enough talented female architects and scholars out there. So again, Charlotte Malter-Barth and Harald Stühlinger set out on a kind of urgent and immediately practical task to establish a kind of Swiss database of women in architecture and urban design aimed at all those who are involved in inviting guest speakers and programming lecture series and setting up search committees for the appointments of chairs, drawing up lists of suitable candidates for professorships, and so on. And so this list was then published as a kind of special issue of the journal Archithese in June 2016. Among the other proposed immediate measures were a double award system for master and PhD thesis, the doubling up of guest professorship, a travel fund for incoming and outgoing female teaching assistants, and gathering more precise data on the gender gap within our department. Figures on female representation in studio critiques, public talks, and panel discussions really, we felt, needed to be established. And we also thought that they were kind of vital to increasing the visibility of women as role models for the students. So we wanted to do something that goes beyond the basic monitoring that is being carried out by ETH Equal every 2 years, which basically only confirms when you look at these, at the kind of graph at the bottom, that in nearly a decade, no significant progress has been achieved in our department, which in a way kind of might be a little surprise if the targets are as low to start with. So in addition to the kind of staff and student records and statistics that ETH Equal gathers, it seemed important to us to obtain figures on female representation in studio critiques, public talks, panel discussions, basically all public events within the department, in order to get a sense of the kind of departmental culture, where the department stands at this moment in time, but also to develop targeted mechanisms and, if necessary, also coercive measures to increase the visibility of women and to ascertain a greater kind of diversity more more broadly across the entire department. And what you can see here at the bottom is basically just posters from several years. I think they're from 2016 to 2018, promoting final critiques, design studio reviews at the end of each semester. And yeah, I mean, there I've just given you some snapshots of the kind of worst offenders that had in those years all male panels. So we started organizing the Parity Talks on International Women's Day in 2016 for the first time as a kind of annual forum to debate and develop an effective set of measures specific to the situation at our department. And we worked together with female graphic designers, illustrators, Osina Völm and Martina Waltert, to develop a kind of visual strategy for these events that in a way also kind of is provocative perhaps, but also humorous. And that's basically put male star architects, but also important historical figures in drag. While the format for these events of a morning symposium and an afternoon workshop has remained relatively constant over the years, our thematic focus shifted with each iteration. So the first Parity Talks was dedicated to a gender setting, since most of us actually lacked a kind of discipline-specific knowledge on gender at the time. But it was also dedicated to exploring the intersection of feminism and architecture from the perspective of architectural theory. So for that, we invited Hélène Frichot to give a talk with architectural history. So Mary Pepczynski here gave a talk, and then later in the evening, there was a keynote lecture by Mary McLeod with urban research. Barbara Zibel, who once taught at ETH and is now a professor in Germany, gave a talk there, and design practice with the architect Cornelia Giesel from Zurich, who runs a kind of all-female practice. In the afternoon, there were then 3 large roundtables with about 20 participants each, dedicated to parity in teaching and learning, parity in research, and parity in practice, and they provided the opportunity to share knowledge and experiences between internal and external participants. And we believe, or it was our belief really, that information is power, and that both data as well as tools for its critical analysis were key to providing arguments for policies. And yet what is recorded and how this is recorded aren't neutral, of course. So when we set out to devise plans and wanted to formulate goals, these for us really kind of constituted political acts. So we needed to enter into a public conversation with our colleagues who would then be most directly affected by those plans, because we really felt that they were the true experts in a way. The results of those debates then crystallized shortly after the first Parity Talks in late spring 2016. And while certain aspects of these, in these kind of 9 points for parity, which you can see projected here, and while certain aspects of the initial 5 points remained, such as an annual qualitative monitoring of the department, kind of self-assessment exercise, dedicated funding instruments, parity in awards, etc. Also new measures were added. Importantly, the demand for parity in professorships and lectureships, guest lectures and studio reviews, as well as in appointment committees, but also the demand to create a parity board with equal representation of female and male students, assistants, and professors. In parallel, we also tried to increase public pressure on the department by publishing these 9 points for parity in the September issue of the Swiss architectural magazine Hochparterre, where they then were accompanied by an interview with our dean at the time, Annette Spiro. Yet internally, a bizarre kind of silence prevailed over the course of the year. none of our proposed measures were adopted. It was quite clear that the department at the time was going through a challenging and difficult phase, as many appointment procedures ran in parallel, but gender parity, which we had argued was fundamental to those appointments, had evidently slipped down the agenda. So Einhard Spiro then in that interview said rather bluntly, we have too few female applicants. Yeah? So exactly that excuse that we kept hearing on and on and on. Yet echoes from search committees for those new faculty members suggested that appointment processes remained tainted by an often thinly veiled gender bias, from shortlisting and invitation criteria of candidates through to applicant evaluation, statements like she's not famous enough, to incidents of mansplaining, or of female committee members basically being talked over by their male colleagues. While there was no official reaction to our 9 points for parity from the department leadership, we did receive some feedback to our work, for instance, from an angry male student who asked us to please stop that crap, and then added in Trump-style capitals that we don't have a gender problem, so stop making problems where there are none. Yet we knew, of course, that there were problems, and that contrary to the student's assertion, not every individual, male or female, had the same opportunities to become a professor at ETH. So as the year drew to a close and it became clearer that none of our 9 points would be realized by the department, the nomination of parity delegates from all 3 faculty groups, students, assistants, and professors, the only exception there, we decided to then organize a second parity talk, symposium, and workshop in March 2017. In the spirit of learning from and lacking institutional support, we then eagerly turned to like-minded international activist groups and collectives in our search for tools for transforming institutions. So among those groups, which have been a kind of constant source of inspiration and empowerment for us, for instance, was the Australian Association Parlour, Women, Equity, Architecture. And so we invited Justine Clark to contribute via Skype. And we were particularly interested in their work in kind of gathering data, but also in creating a kind of platform and in formulating guidelines for equitable architectural practice. We also included the Feminist Art and Architecture Collaborative, Anna Maria Leon, Olga Tolumi, Tessa Panath-Pollack, and Martina Tanga, whose kind of collective teaching and research efforts were of interest to us, their idea of kind of sharing syllabi. And then finally, we included, again, the group of scholars from KTH Stockholm. And this group has basically sought to establish an ambitious gender-based curriculum in the architecture department at KTH under the direction of Marlene Orberg-Wennerholm, who came to give a talk. So they treated feminist thinking as something that was integral to architectural design, to history and theory, visible, among others, in the work of Hélène Frichot. So subsequently, and I talked a little bit about this this morning in the workshop, Emily Eliza Scott and I, who had basically chaired a roundtable discussion on architecture and feminist pedagogies, were then invited to the Architecture and Feminisms Conference of the Architectural Humanities Research Association in Stockholm, and this then kind of inspired our efforts to teach a kind of interdepartmental seminar dedicated to that topic. The goal for the afternoon workshop was basically to facilitate an open discussion of our proposed 9 measures from the previous year, with as many members from our own department as possible, but also with representatives from other institutions. And we invited here public employers, for instance, the municipality, which had implemented a kind of ambitious program for gender equality. So we were eager to hear from both of these groups how viable and effective they thought our suggestions were. In 4 parallel roundtable discussions, each of them defining a specific goal or area of invention, institutional structures, gender monitoring and feedback being one of them, increasing women's visibility and overcoming the lack of female role models, the other, career development and mentoring, and the kind of relationship between work and family was a third, and raising awareness and building knowledge on women, gender, and architecture was a 4th area. We then basically sought to further define the content of these 9 points in more detail. So the resulting annotated list of measures was then to become the basis for the final policies to make it into the department's gender action plan. So far the idea at least. So after more inaction on the department side and another round of now increasingly severe parity fatigue on our part, we decided to press the department on its verbal commitment to the cause precisely at the moment when a transfer of the deanship came up. So we forced another vote on a kind of firm commitment to implement a set of measures along with the establishment of a structure to facilitate this process in the departmental conference in May 2017, and we won this with only 1 vote against the motion. Now, according to that motion, a Parity Board was to be established and a draft of the Gender Action Plan to be submitted by fall semester 2017, so about kind of 9 months ago. It took then until April 2018 and another vote in between, which basically established the bylaws and institutional basis for this new board, which was now called the Parity and Diversity Commission, for the members of this group to actually meet for the first time. And the current status is that there is a kind of dispute between the Commission as well as the department, who again already positively voted on this issue, and the department leadership, so our dean, over the creation of an administrative support and strategic development position for an independent kind of parity and diversity officer within the department, a role which we believe is vital not only to making effective the work of the Commission, but which has also particular relevance in this current moment. So the only measure that we were successful in implementing was basically the one regarding parity in public events at the department, though there are no mechanisms in case of non-compliance, and this is basically just a poster of the recent final design reviews from the last spring semester, where you can see some of the figures and how it's sort of changed. So generally, not looking so bad, there's definitely been some effect of that action. And I think what it's kind of done is that it's, in a way, has created kind of greater transparency. The chairs now know that someone is looking, and the chairs can also compare how their efforts are kind of, against one another. So I wanted to conclude basically and lead over into the discussion with 3 thoughts that have also come up at different points throughout the week. The first aspect, perhaps, is this kind of issue of historical amnesia that I think came up on Monday evening in Tatjana Schneider's talk. So what we can learn basically for our situation, for our work today, from looking at the relatively young or recent history of the women's rights movement, both within Switzerland in general, but also in our institution and Swiss academia. And here I've just sort of assembled a number of kind of key dates. And as you can see, so Switzerland was one of the countries that was particularly late, for instance, in giving women the right to vote in 1971. Basically the second last country in Europe, followed only by Liechtenstein, and really one of the last countries in the world. And so one of the Swiss cantons, Appenzell Innerrhoden, didn't have the right to vote for women until 1991, in fact. In 1985, we had the first female professor at ETH in 1987, and kind of, lobbying group, but across the entire university, across the entire ETH was established. So that was a group that also kind of brought together students, assistants, lecturers, and alumni. It's a bit similar to ours. So you could also see that this, kind of fight for the position of women in the school was something that had always kind of happened from below, from the bottom up. In 1991, there was a women's strike, which then basically led to the creation of a sort of women's center, and then subsequently an equal opportunities office, just a couple of years basically before the Swiss government ruled on the Federal Act for Gender Equality in 1995. So, but still, we're sort of confronted with this problem in our institution, and we could ask ourselves, why the comment that the architect Beatrice Schnitter in 1980 made, that ETH basically remained a male bastion, why this kind of still rings true today. So perhaps a useful question to return to then is the relationship between the kind of continuing engagement from below on the one hand and the establishment of institutional structures on the other. So during the women's strike in 1991, Vesada had demanded the creation of a women's office at ETH, but after its establishment, the engagement of student and staff groups then kind of quickly subsided, as recent historical studies have shown. So is the consequence to be drawn from this then that the implementation of institutional structures should actually be avoided? And I think we came to the conclusion for us that this is not the case. So if we look at ETH Equal, so that is the sort of central organ in a way within ETH in charge of equal opportunities. However, the structure as we kind of come to understand it over the course of our work is really kind of insufficiently equipped to face the challenges that lie ahead of such a sort of vast institution like ETH. There are only kind of 3 part-time staff members for the entire university, and the Equal office has a very small budget of its own. So ETH Equal, in our view, really has become a kind of mere alibi. While giving the impression that gender and diversity are priorities for the institution, the structure simply doesn't have the means to do much more than basic monitoring and career counseling. And ETH female staff members have even criticized ETH Equal because it appears that its efforts are concentrated on preparing women for job interviews rather than tackling kind of structural reasons or structural kind of causes for discrimination and institutional kind of core issues.
What was the strike for?
The women's strike? It was a national strike.
So what was the demand?
It was for equal pay, basically.
Equal pay for people. So problematizing our own
voluntary work and our call for the creation of structures within the department, in a way kind of are informed also by critiques of feminists like Silvia Federici or Ali Hochschild, for instance, of what one might call the labor of love, kind of gendered forms of overlooked and undervalued care work that extend from the household to other contexts, such as institutions, but that are essential for the reproduction of the system. So as Makushla Robinson, for instance, recently wrote in an article, having been culturally constructed as an act of love and nurture inherent to the female gender, housework and similarly care work has not been considered real work. So the logic behind this then is that love is its own reward, the fulfillment of a natural drive, which is inherently pleasurable and therefore does not require monetary compensation. And I think one can easily see sort of how that sort of translates into kind of caring for an institution. So, invisible labor, she continues, is no longer limited to the home, but liberation from the restricted role of the housewife has not simply done away with the gendered division of labor. Capitalism, always good at appropriating and metabolizing critique, has taken this division into the workplace so that women, no longer bound to the home, bring the skills of the home with them to work. They end up performing double the labor, that for which they are compensated, and the kind of effective, caring, invisible labor for which they are not. A second aspect that maybe I wanted to bring into the discussion is that there seems to be, and this is something that is sort of encouraging for us to see, there seems to be a kind of new intergenerational dialogue, students kind of reaching out and becoming more active and critical of their own institutions. So, for example, what you can see here is at the 50th anniversary of the GTA, there was a kind of big debate about the end of theory with Kurt Forster, Peter Eisenman, and Jacques Herzog, moderated by Philipp Ursprung, and the students had then sort of taken a picture of that and produced cards and responded with these cards to an appointment process that was ongoing at the time within the Institute GTA, which had never actually had any kind of full tenured female professor. And so, they sort of produced these cards and then plastered the lifts, the walls of the lifts within the architecture department with them as a kind of critical response. So this kind of learning from past episodes, perhaps, of kind of institutional engagement and sort of understanding oneself as kind of being part of a longer tradition kind of seem to be kind of key aspects. And the sort of third sort of aspect that I wanted to kind of come back to is this kind of need to work collectively and to kind of build platforms across different institutions. And here I just wanted to draw attention to the work of the Bauhaus 5 Alliance, which is basically, again, I mean, one could sort of see this very much as kind of us working with or trying to work within a sort of neoliberal kind of alliance between 5 leading research-intensive European universities in architecture and the built environment. And so the alliance, the aim of that alliance primarily is to push the boundaries, as it claims, of current practices in pedagogies, research, and practice, and to raise awareness for the value of research and innovation in architecture and the built environment for the wider benefit of society, according to that alliance. But gender had been completely overlooked by it. So basically, one of the Bauhaus 5 partners, so this group includes basically UCL in London, the architecture department at Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, our department, the Technical University in Delft, and TU Munich. And Munich basically reached out first to kind of set up a workshop to focus on questions of equality, diversity, and inclusion in Munich in November last year, and to kind of use this alliance to advance this agenda. And since then we have basically had another workshop at the Technical University in Delft recently in May, and have planned to now kind of carry out annual workshops to sort of strengthen that and to exchange between the institutions and in a way sort of learn from one another and sort of set up structures perhaps by kind of learning from specific sort of local legislation, specific kind of local policies, how they can be translated, implemented through this initiative, through this alliance into our own institution. And that's what I would end with. Thank you.
Thanks, Torsten, for sharing your experiences like with regard to all your efforts and struggles in the institutional realm. I think it became clear what collectivity means for your parity group activities and alliances. I would be interested in put that out for discussion generally, as I did in the other events. 2 points. Culturally, you hinted to how Swiss architectural culture changes, and I would like to hear a bit more how you would locate it within Swiss architectural culture, both as a problem but also as the opportunity somehow as you approach journals to publish. And the other point is institutionally, like you discussed this morning, that it takes longer somehow to implement change. I wonder what it takes and like how to stay with the trouble. What is it that you plan? So, but maybe Mab first for the discussion.
Thank you again for the talk. As Kim mentioned earlier, we're going to start with the 4 respondents. Does anybody want to begin?
Sure. Just as a, I guess, brief disclaimer, as a young white male individual, I think the reason I'm on this panel is not by choice, but it's due to an alphabetical order because my last name starts with P. I'd rather have given actually my seat in the spotlight to an individual with a long history dealing with these matters. At the same time, having also studied in Zurich, I really appreciate the tremendously important work that you do. It's incredibly important, but I also want to ask you something on the notion, I guess, on accountability. When discussing a case of concern, usually there's this thing that one sometimes hears is that someone saying, oh, I couldn't have done anything else, it's not my fault, it's the system's fault. I'm not responsible for it, but arguably we all are the system. And I'm wondering whether there are limitations in your work where you've seen, okay, I can actually not go further because it's out of my reach, and how do you deal with these problems? What are there limits? How do you deal with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for almost all of us, that we perceived limits quite strongly. I mean, one of the limits obviously is the kind of power relationship that is set up between professors and assistants, doctoral candidates, and so on. Who kind of got involved with this initiative and, in a way, also kind of feared perhaps sort of repercussions or didn't want to sort of expose themselves too much. Just didn't want to be perceived as kind of troublemakers, I suppose. So that is kind of one, I guess, sort of limitation or something that sort of kept people away sometimes at certain moment from the initiative, particularly when it came to speaking out in sort of public forums, as long as we were kind of in closed rooms or sitting in the cafe on the campus and so on, it was all fine. But when it came to these kind of crucial moments of, putting yourself in front of the departmental conference, making a sort of presentation about the issue again. You could already see, we would typically sort of push to the end of the agenda first, so these departmental conferences are also sort of very long sort of procedures that you have to go through, lasting 2 hours and so on. And then you could really see in the faces of people, this sort of gender problem was the last thing that they wanted to hear about, sort of at the end of that long meeting. And then to sort of, still get up there and kind of make yourself heard and put emphasis on it and, sort of face your professor, that I think for some people sort of proved a sort of challenge or proved to be a kind of limitation. And of course, all of us are, or the majority of people are employed on sort of fixed term contracts as well. Contracts for academic staff are renewed annually at ETH as a kind of general principle. So also there is I suppose, a kind of degree of precarity, maybe, that sort of also plays into this, and where people sort of fear repercussion.
As a follow-up, I think it's interesting, as part of this long, week-long seminar series, we've also spoken about employing fiction in order to fly under the radar when you have certain conditions that cannot be openly talked about. And I think some of us in this room might have come across a list that's been circulated on the web, referred to as the Shitty Architecture Man list, where some people were specifically addressed with their names. So would you say that in order to have a seat at the table, is anonymity an important part of your work? Is it more strategic to not put all cards on the table yet?
Yeah, to an extent, I guess so. But then there's always, I suppose, a sort of degree of responsibility, and there are moments when you basically just you have to be there in person. You can't sort of forever sort of remain anonymous or sort of
Sure. Did you want to go? Okay. So I speak in the mic. Okay, great. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about, I guess, the relationship between parity and, parity and feminist pedagogy. And so we're talking about implementing gender parity, and but a large part of that is also through feminist methodologies and pedagogies. And so we're talking about them at the same time, but they're separate. They're quite separate things, or they're perceived as separate things. So I'm wondering if you can speak about the relationship between the two and the importance of implementing both of them in tandem.
So for us, this idea of, or the goal of, in a way, kind of introducing feminism, feminist theory, or gender theory, giving it a place in the curriculum where basically it had no place at all for a long time, basically since the mid-1990s, seemed to be a kind of key goal, a kind of key aspect of our agenda, and was something that we discussed from the start. But actually, really none of us felt, sort of particularly well equipped. None of us were sort of gender scholars or kind of gender experts in that way. Felt sort of properly equipped to teach a course like that. The only exception would have been Eliana Perotti and Katja Frey, but they are employed in the department as researchers, so they don't have any kind of teaching duties, any teaching involvement. So what I then did together with Emily Scott was, we thought about, okay, how can we, in a way, sort of get the expertise that we need in order to set up this course. So we had a kind of goal of establishing this interdepartmental seminar, as I sort of explained in the workshop this morning, which then sort of turned into a much kind of humbler and smaller elective course, elective seminar in the master's program. But yeah, we basically sort of started engaging in a conversation with people outside of our institution and sort of try to get the knowledge from them. And this is basically how this kind of collaboration working with KTH Stockholm also came about, and that they sort of invited us to moderate this roundtable on architecture and feminist pedagogy, where we basically had sort of 5 experienced teachers around the table who presented their sort of strategies of how to address that problem in kind of history, theory, but also in the kind of design studio environment. And so, yeah, Jane Rendell was there as well to kind of moderate that discussion. And so that then sort of led to another collectively authored article in Field Journal, and yeah, provided for us in a way the kind of blueprint, or kind of gave us sort of key ideas of how to go about teaching a course like that. But again, as with the problem of kind of implementing measures, this issue of permanence here also seemed to be a kind of concern. So this, when I started sort of planning that course, I had gone back in the history of ETH a little bit to kind of figure out, okay, has anybody else ever sort of taught something on gender? So in the mid-90s, there was, for a sort of short period of time, a guest professor, Petra Stojanek, who was before an assistant with Flora Richard-Roncati. And she had established what was called a diploma elective course on women in the built environment, which was, essentially sort of trying to uncover the role of that women had in the production of the built environment on kind of various levels. And, the course sort of tried to recuperate, I think, some of the sort of hidden figures and biographies of women architects, but also looked at kind of the role of women on a sort of more structural level, as kind of clients and as sort of other actors that work in the built environment. So yeah, so that course was the only sort of instance that we could find, and that basically had disappeared when this guest professor, Petra Stojanek, left ETH, and then the topic was basically sort of absent again. And so for us now, the challenge is how can we, in a way, with this seminar that we have taught for 1 semester, and which we will now continue to teach for another 2 semesters, how can we create something that perhaps becomes the root for something more permanent? Or we talked this morning also about kind of changing the canon, or sort of changing the content of the architectural curriculum, approaches within architectural pedagogy on a sort of more sustained level. And that for us is also, or for me, seems a kind of big question, how one can achieve that. And sort of, leave that small bubble of the elective seminar where you can sort of do a little bit of that, but how can it sort of seep into the kind of core curriculum?
I've also got a question about, I guess I'm very interested in how the feminist pedagogy can become really useful to architecture, and particularly in the way you frame architecture, its central role of imagining desired futures. And this quote that this concept that you bring in from Donna Haraway of conducting research through speculative fabulation, this kind of like taking what's out there in reality and using it to kind of concoct a possible alternative. And I just wonder if you see any connection or any way to inform the kind of traditional way that architecture has imagined desired futures, particularly the kind of like visionary utopian architecture that we have in the exhibition next door. Maybe if you'd like to speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can only give, I guess, a sort of insufficient and quite generic answer to that, which perhaps kind of goes back to this idea of situatedness, or a kind of situated approach that is also kind of key to Haraway's work, that you basically engage with the conditions of a sort of particular place, I mean, what Tatiana also talked about on Monday, rather than in a way sort of trying to work autonomously, or rather than sort of trying to come up with sort of grand visions, you sort of try to deal with the sort of messy realities of a sort of given site or of a kind of given context. But, nonetheless kind of working, I guess, in a way that also, sort of seeks to be bold, and not just sort of merely reactive. But, I mean, I don't teach architectural design, so for me that is a kind of tricky question to answer, how one can sort of, really, I guess, apply these ideas to a kind of architectural design studio context. You'd have to ask, I guess, some sort of feminist pedagogues around the table here. I don't know. I'm sure there are some.
The ways juries are put together, you also talk about this, and that's part of pedagogy in a way. So you deal with it.
Yeah.
I would like to know about the production of knowledge and the audience of your knowledge. I mean, what did you actually think about the audience when you started to work on this idea?
Do you mean in the sense of who we thought our audience would be, or I mean, it's a tricky question, because I mean, audience perhaps is the sort of wrong the wrong word maybe, or the wrong way to kind of think about. I mean, we sort of saw ourselves very much as sort of, addressing the institute. What we wanted to do, or what we felt was kind of necessary, was for us to have a kind of seat, to have a sort of stake in those discussions, that in a way, I mean, of course there's ETH Equal, and they draw up this sort of gender action plan as a sort of relatively abstract kind of framework, but there was a clear kind of delegated duty into the department to sort of implement it, to come up with a set of measures, and we felt that it's in a way sort of upon us maybe, also upon the students, staff members, to have a kind of say how these measures exactly should be designed, and not just to leave it to the kind of bureaucrats and managerial elites in a way, that sort of come up with all these sort of fancy slogans, but to also kind of think through of, what does this mean actually, and, how can we actually sort of make these things, how can we make them work in a way? So, I mean, it's almost like, I guess we were to some extent also an audience, in the sense that we tried with these parity talks to create a forum to become listeners to our colleagues, what kinds of needs do you actually have? We wanted to establish a kind of consultation process. We didn't just want to say, oh, you know, we think this is a good measure, but we wanted to hear, you know, okay, where are there problems within the institution, and then to kind of draw up measures that in a way sort of work within the sort of broader goals and frameworks of this plan, you know, which I guess everybody can agree upon. You know, they're quite agreeable anyway, you know, but they still, for us, we felt that they needed to be filled beyond kind of these kind of bold claims with actual content.
Plan of I guess, was there a fear during the planning stage of compliance issues or quotas? I think you had mentioned something about a non-binding institutional strategy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, does that revolve around these issues of whether or not we can meet certain compliance or quota kind of scenarios?
Yeah, very much so. So the institution generally is very resistant towards quotas. And so not just the institution, but also kind of individual members. So in the department, also the kind of mood is one that is, very much against any kind of quota systems, you know, or, anything that would put sort of force or kind of obligations that need to be fulfilled. So, you know, they formulate these sort of targets for certain time periods. You know, I mentioned this kind of goal of achieving about 15% female professors across the ETH between 2013 and 16. And then, you know, they basically publish a report that they haven't met their target, but then nothing sort of follows from that. You know, they sort of say, oh, yeah, we haven't met the goal, but, well, you know, we'll try again. Yeah.
It's like avoiding sort of the contractual obligation of actually coming through on a social agenda in a way.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk and for going through all this. I'm wanting to assume that, and I'm hoping that everybody in this room right now is pleased with the work that the Parity Group is doing and supports it. And since we're among friends, I was also hoping to ask a fairly critical question.
Sure.
And I'm thinking about your use of the phrase equal representation in the context of feminist theory, specifically going back to the 80s with Haraway and Butler and many of the people that you're referencing today. The extent to which they're trying to break down binaries between people, the notion of equal representation in the poster that has the percentage of women versus the percentage of men, not mentioning trans folks, not mentioning non-binary folks. Specifically, since you invoke fourth wave feminism and thus intersectionality along the way. And I'm looking at this poster too, where it says, without the vision of women architects and diverse perspectives, as everything but women is under diverse perspectives. I was just hoping that you could expand a little bit on the ways that the Parity Group thinks about intersectionality and the way that they're working through these things.
Yeah, so there are obviously, I mean, since it's a group and it's composed of different individuals, there are different positions on this. So I have my own position. So for instance, in the seminar that I was teaching, we were quite concerned about this problem of binaries and sort of trying to move away from those binary conceptions. But, you know, certainly it's not an idea that I would say is common consensus among everyone in the Parity Group. So this kind of goal of, I guess, reaching parity, you know, I mean, it's already the name, I guess, to an extent is problematic in that sense, you know, to speak of parity. because that, in a way, sort of presumes that, you know, that there are two sides, male and female. And so, yeah, it's a debate, and I have my position, but I wouldn't say that there is consensus within the group with regards to, you know, questions around, non-binary identities, trans identities, and these kind of problems of intersectionality that you point to. That's the only kind of answer that I can give.
Could I just ask a quick
Sure.
follow-up? Have trans issues, other queer issues, non-binary, have these things come up, not in the parity group, but institutionally in front of, say, the
so
board?
in my seminar it's been addressed, but otherwise, in the institution itself, it hasn't been addressed at all.
Could you pass the microphone to Alfredo after your question?
It was it's pretty much a follow-up on the question you raised. I mean, the direct question was, what is if there's a definition of the word parity within the group? Because if we think of feminist theory, I mean, it is necessary as a universal thinking because it is a counter-narrative to the hegemony of patriarchy, right? And patriarchy not only affects women, affects many others, including women and men of color, you name trans, queer, so on and so forth. And so the question is, like, how to guarantee that if those 9 points are implemented, we are not going to keep reproducing the system. I mean, if we follow the brilliant analysis that Charles showed us today, how this white male architect portrays himself, what if the ETH helps to construct that image for a group of white privileged women? Would that fix the problem? Wouldn't we reproducing the same? I think it might help the ETH. It would make it look a less provincial institution. But I don't think it would fix the deep political problem that we're facing, which is representation of various other groups. So the question is if the group has thought about these issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think generally there has been a sort of move towards broader issues of diversity in the last couple of years, for sure. But again, you know, I mean, the group doesn't have, I guess, a sort of consensus about a sort of particular sort of theoretical framework, a particular sort of feminist theorist that is sort of guiding our actions in that sense, you know. I mean, that's, it's not something that the group sort of has established as a sort of, you know, common basis, and, you know, now we're sort of working with that particular kind of set of theory or theories. But to answer your other question, I mean, the only way that I can answer it is in the reverse, is that by saying that not doing anything is just going to sort of, you know, keep the situation pretty much the same for probably the next 50 years or something, or even longer. I don't know. I mean, I have the impression that in the student body, there are quite dramatic changes, and that basically the institution and the people who teach there are not really, I mean, I've been approached by, numerous students who have sort of very diverse cultural backgrounds, very interesting kind of biographies that have migrated through different places and want to write about, certain kinds of architectures or certain kinds of locales that I think nobody seems to have the expertise to sort of guide that work or to sort of properly supervise it. So from that side, again, sort of from the bottom up, I feel that, okay, something sort of needs to change.
So then you see a distinction between the politics and the power that the pedagogy has vis-a-vis the political agenda of a group. Is there a distinction there?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the sense that like I say, we're individuals, and each of us, I guess, sort of try to do sort of, within this sort of broader framework of kind of, or the sort of broader goal of greater equality. Each of us sort of try to find their own sort of ways of sort of achieving this, or of kind of enacting it in the way that we can, and using this sort of frameworks and ideas that guide us individually. But there's no kind of overarching.
I guess it's more of the same, because maybe I never understood, like you were quoting my wife, who would say that, and she was a gender theorist, and writing about, her PhD was about feminist manifestos, and she always would say that in German it's called gender mainstreaming. So I don't know if this is a word that is used in the English world. So she should say, on a pragmatic level, she understands that we need that, but it's something that it's not hitting the target at all. In my words, and also in my situation that I'm now for 6 years, is that I never understand why we speak about gender mainstreaming, because I always understood gender as something that that is learned, that is you are put in a situation, and you're and it's not so why don't we speak about sex mainstreaming? Because then it's also like sometimes I have this feeling, especially in Europe, that we speak about, as others have kind of pointed out, women also need to be part of that system, but we don't speak about the life situation of these people. Do they have kids, and so on and so forth. There are so many other, or whom else do we exclude? We speak about things that we see. There is a Asian people on the board. So we have to have everybody on the board, but we don't speak about the workers that we exclude, for example, in a discussion, and so on and so forth. So the question would be for somehow, how far would you want to go? Is it, of course, I think this is really important, to put that on the table, and I think it's awful that how you kind of experience that power game that is being played, but at the same time, how far are you willing to push it? It's
a question that is very hard to answer. Of course, one would always kind of, I guess, feel inclined to say, I would want to go as far as possible. But I think, I mean, for me, this work has started from, sort of engagement with my immediate sort of context and this sort of, what I found there. And I can't really sort of dissociate what I'm doing sort of from these kind of, I guess, pragmatic, practical. So in that sense, that's perhaps also why I'm a bit sort of resistant or reluctant to be guided in that work purely by a kind of ideological agenda. And why I sort of maybe dissociate that a little bit, or sort of, because I just feel like, I mean, the number of people and the number of actors involved perhaps is sort of, too great for me to sort of make a bold claim to say, but I think this is the right way.
just in that context of that discussion, I'm just interested in what you talked about, kind of in terms of care work and this idea of caring for the institution, and also something that you wrote about, the kind of burden of the voluntary work, that this is just extra stuff that you have to do. And I wonder if you see any way for this role of caring for the institution, as problematic as that might be, could become itself institutionalized and recognized for the value that it brings and become something that can bring on these various issues as they come up.
I mean, I was sort of thinking about this earlier today, actually, and sort of, could I think of sort of other models or people that I have come across, that I've encountered, who've done similar work of sort of engaging critically with the institutions that they're working in and sort of making this part of their work in a kind of meaningful way, but also where it sort of feeds back critically into the institution. And so the only case that I could really think of was, again, sort of Jane Randell, who I'd worked with, and her involvement in UCL, I think back in her role as the Vice Dean of Research, when she was sort of getting involved in a research project that was heavily funded by, I think, a sort of mining enterprise or something. And since then, she's become very engaged within UCL in kind of, fossil divestment issues and sort of, where does research money, research funding come from, and so on, and took up a position in an ethics committee. But then she also sort of, she doesn't just do that work as a kind of additional burden, but it becomes part of her practice as a kind of critically engaged thinker, writer, scholar within the institution. So she also uses that work and sort of, writes about it, publishes that work in academic journals, even though I think it's kind of very difficult for her to sort of place that in, again, sort of within these kind of conventions of academic publishing and the sort of pressures that exist and so on. So I think, it's perhaps also because that work in itself is not considered kind of, worthy of sort of any attention or of being talked about. It then also becomes difficult to sort of, how do you make that work sort of a meaningful part of your kind of routine or of your work as an academic, and not just, sort of care work that happens on the side. And so, I mean, that was the only example that I could sort of think about.
So I just wanted to both make a comment and then ask a question specifically. So the comment is that given the composition of who you were describing are on the Parity Board and the differential of power that's there, that a lot of the folks who are participating are the ones who are either adjuncts or the marginal types of people who can clearly see the problem but don't have power at the table. And so just speaking up about that is, it's something that can have real consequences. It can have a real negative impact. And so in that sense, I think it's important to acknowledge the sort of the bravery and the kind of the ethical responsibility with which you are acting in this way, right? And so I don't think anybody here is sort of not seeing that or sort of thinks that it's not the right thing to do or anything like that. I think everyone here is really about asking questions about tactics, strategy, and those sorts of things. And that's really also, for me, what I was interested in, particularly when you describe the email from the male student, right? And my question really is about, how do you change the mind of that person to get them to be the one who's pushing for the agenda and the change? And the part that sort of leaves me unsettled here is just the kind of the politesse of your efforts. Like they're so reasonable and they're so nice and they don't disrupt, right? And when I think about, especially when you have that high degree of power differential, it makes me think about the student protests on Cornell University's campus in 1969, and when they brought in O.M. Ungers, and he was asked the question of, did you think it was ethical for the black students to do this and to disrupt the campus? And he said, when democracy leaves you no mechanism, that is the only mechanism left. The only mechanism left is to disrupt so that people can take your concerns seriously. And so I'm wondering if there are ways to fold into what it is that you're doing at the sort of bureaucratic level, at the level with the administration, another way, which is sort of fomenting interest among the students, fomenting interest among some of the senior faculty, ways that these efforts will be disruptive so that you can build the political will to actually do certain things. Because I think that, on paper, building in the kind of the targets and et cetera, that's one thing. But once it builds a spirit within the institution, you don't have to do anything. Like it takes care of itself. It breathes and lives on its own. And I think that, and particularly because I teach about race in architecture, and there are, and especially since I taught in the U.S. South, where you don't know if your student is conservative or not, it really does. Like in some ways, that part of that job is not even necessarily changing their minds, but forcing them to legitimize their position and forcing them to clearly articulate what the other side's position is. And so I wonder if there is a strategy for when you get that email from that male student, I mean, not to shame that person or whatever, right? But to sort of allow for kind of dialogue to occur so that, there might be an opportunity there as a potential convert. And then that person goes and talks to other students and other students, and then there's a kind of more disruptive, organic effort parallel to your own.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question and that comment. It's really great and is something that we have thought about. So, I mean, with that particular case of that email, we did respond to that email, of course. We didn't sort of leave it without a reply, and we had invited that student to then come to one of the meetings, and of course, I mean, he didn't want to expose himself. In fact, he was also kind of personally known to one of the members of the Parity group, and I then asked my colleague, did you not like kind of approach this student, just if you know him anyway, why can't you just sort of ask him, just engage in a conversation? But he sort of felt uncomfortable doing that as well. So that kind of personal conversation never actually took place, unfortunately, and that student kind of avoided joining or kind of responding to our invitation. Yeah, I mean, sort of radicalizing the students perhaps is sort of, I shouldn't be saying this, but yeah, in a way, sort of planting the seed and then see what happens is something that we're quite eager to do, and which I've sort of tried to do also with that class that I taught, just to, yeah, confront, and there were students kind of participating in that class who were also kind of skeptical about the agenda and some of the sort of claims that we had made and so on. And so, there were quite interesting conversations taking place, but generally I feel that, for instance, this kind of postcard action, which I guess, seems pretty benign, but for the ETH context, that was almost like, oh, wow, finally something is happening, finally someone is doing something here, I mean, it's, yeah, and the fact that they had sort of also very directly and immediately sort of responded to that appointment process, which of course is something that is always kind of held extremely confidential, and that in a way sort of made it for me already quite, sort of it seemed to be pushing the boundaries of, what is usually kind of acceptable in the institution already. So that was a kind of encouraging sign in the right direction. To this day, I don't know who was behind it. I mean, these pictures, then kind of popped up in the Instagram account of some of the students who were participating in the seminar that I was teaching, so I have no idea whether it was someone who was part of that class or not. But yeah, generally, I mean, we would be very happy, and in fact, in that kind of article that Charlotte and I wrote, where there's also a kind of fictional narrative that complements the accounts, the sort of description of what was happening, and sort of accompanies the archive documents. There we are sort of imagining this kind of unrest, or this sort of more radical kind of assertion from the student side. Yeah.
I've seen the syllabus, and I think it's a great syllabus. I wonder if, however, you might surreptitiously add, not even a module, but like case studies throughout that shows like students who have taken disruptive action in relationship to activism and protest, right? And I say this in a joking way, but to sort of also encourage, because I think a lot of architects are afraid of activism, and they're afraid of being in front of the issue and becoming the personality. And one of the wonderful things about a course like the one you're talking about that leads to this kind of structure, this formal structure, is that you're literally giving people ideas, right? So in a way, like, even though you're giving them the information to start with, it's very possible for someone to feel like it's their own idea. They've embraced that particular approach, and so they can take and do different tactics. And so the postering of the elevator, to me, is a visual sign that someone's interested and they're trying to participate. And to me, that's a great opportunity. I mean, I remember at my institution at one point, there was a trouble. There were politics about who was going to be the next chair of the department. Someone in the graduate student body, and it was never revealed whom, printed a poster that said, "Pick a chair, any chair." Right? Like they were trying to participate in this kind of exclusive discussion, and that actually motivated faculty to become much more precise in sort of what they were after. They addressed the student body because they thought that there was a concern with them being ambiguous about what it is they wanted, or at least veiled in what the criteria was about. And I think that those courses, from the periphery, there are certain strategies that allow you to inject that into the center. So I don't know, I like the bureaucratic angle that you guys are going in. I just wonder if you could also mix it up and allow for other kinds of things to occur.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great suggestion. I'll take it to heart more.
Any other questions?
So I was quite, to begin with, I really appreciated your presentation, and I think that oscillating between this notion of gender parity and the question of to what degree are you perhaps being disruptive within your own institution, but for those of us as outsiders, it's easy, I think, to ask a larger question about how disruptive is what you're doing, and can it be more disruptive? Can it have more agency? And the thing that struck me so much in your presentation was the fact that the ETH has this target goal of 15%. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, because in the context of gender parity, which I was just Googling the term to make sure that I was correct, I mean, it really is about balance and equity.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to know how your collective perceives the university's interpretation of parity of 15% being enough. And I think you said currently it's 11%, or is it even lower than that?
In the department, it's 11.8%, and across the university, about 13.5% or something.
Because I could imagine, and I believe your name is Charles, right? I could imagine, I mean, with Charles's suggestion about being more disruptive, like, would it be possible for your collective to step forward and demand that the university's target and the department's target is 50%? Because I think if the minute you start pushing
Yeah.
to ask for something that
Yeah.
may be, in the context of your university, incredibly disruptive.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, even if anytime you're negotiating terms, right? I mean, the advice anyone is given, negotiating a salary for a new position is, of course, you always ask for more than you think you're going to get, because there's a moment of, coming to terms with establishing a middle ground. So within that context, maybe demanding that the university and department don't perceive parity as 50-50, but is it something that's much more radical to say we should shoot for 75%? Does it result in a middle ground? And then another comment that I was going to make is one thing that I've encountered at my own institution, because there's been a lot of concerns about the lack of female faculty, about inviting critics, guest lecturers, and so forth, that I think sometimes we've actually swung too much to the degree of trying to overcompensate. So for instance, at a recent year-end review, it was only female architects who were invited. Is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Is it neither? And then I think also the question of course, today we're speaking about gender, but the larger question of diversity. And does it become problematic? Because, for instance, if we invite 3 jurors for a panel and they're all white English-speaking women who come from elite institutions, like, does that then just produce yet another problem?
Yeah, I mean, that second question, I guess, goes in a similar direction to the question that Alfredo has asked before, and I would tend to agree that I think, of course, other aspects of diversity kind of also need to kind of figure into this, but perhaps to kind of return to the first part of the question of sort of pushing for more. I mean, so we've always held the view from the start, actually, and formulated that demand pretty vividly from the start, that there should be 50%, or that the target for the department should be 50% female professors. And, whenever there is an appointment coming up, we sort of, go to the dean again or sort of knock at their office. But the problem is that the appointment procedure itself is extremely opaque. It's very hierarchical as well. In the end, it's the president of the ETH who has the final say about who gets appointed and who doesn't. The pre-selection of candidates, the sort of, going through lists and so on, all of that kind of happens behind closed doors, and at the point when the committee in a way sort of comes into play, then the list is already fixed, and that might not have enough women on it, or perhaps a kind of, I don't know, selection of people that are so hard to compare, or where two people suddenly sort of don't fall into the overall agenda and therefore already kind of immediately fall off the list again. And so, all of these processes are very complex and difficult for us as this kind of small group to kind of intervene into. But ideally, we would like to be, for instance, present on each of the commissions, search committees for jobs, but again, it's that sort of problem of kind of time. How much time can you invest into this? I mean, ideally, you need to be more people, or you need to have someone who has kind of dedicated time to give attention to this, to take care of this.
Is there a last question? All right. With that, then, we'll conclude. Thank you again, Torsten, so much for your wonderful talk. Tomorrow, the series continues and concludes with Charles Davis's lecture. And thank you all so much for coming, and have a great evening.